A very warm welcome to this side event of the Munich Peace Conference with a subtle and well-chosen title, Piecing It Together. Piecing as in peace, obviously. My name is Anne Gideon. I'm a Protestant pastor, and maybe someone could close the door. Thank you. I'm the special envoy of the Lutheran of the Protestant Church in Germany to the government in Berlin and at the European Union. And I've been asked to facilitate this panel, which is a great honor, and I'm pleased and grateful for the trust that the Order of Malta is placing in me with this task. We've got a very prominent and exciting panel here, and I'm going to introduce them as they're about to speak. But first of all, we've got the honor, pleasure, and privilege to hear the opening address of His Excellency the Grand Chancellor Riccardo Potano de Montecupa from the Order of Malta. He is in this position since September last year, and so he came into it in a very, very challenging world situation, and we are so excited to hear what he has to say. Your Excellency.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, distinguished guests, it is a pleasure to address such an important audience, and I thank the organizers of the Munich Security Conference for facilitating this side event called Piecing It Together, Religion, Diplomacy and Conflicts, which focuses on the complex and multifaceted relationship between religion and diplomacy. It is widely recognized that the role of religion and religiously inspired political activism seems to be an increasingly important factor in global affairs in the 21st century. This is evident not only in the Middle East and North Africa, but also in Europe and the broader West. With 84% of the world population belonging to religions, a figure that is estimated to grow to 87 in 2030, governments have realized how crucial the role of religion in international affairs has become. It is not surprising, therefore, that many governments have a special section in their foreign minister devoted to religion and foreign policy. Recently, the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Antonio Tajani, during a visit to the Order of Malta, announced the appointment of a special envoy for the protection of Christian minorities in the world, an area in which the Order of Malta is very committed with regard to all ethnic and religious minorities. Furthermore, he has also financed a special fund to support activities that in every part of the world are dedicated to defense of Christian minorities, or to humanitarian and health aid that can be linked to interreligious dialogue. And at this regard, a few months ago, the Italian Foreign Ministry has also appointed a special envoy for interreligious dialogue, testifying to the growing role that religions have in global relations. Religions and religious actors can indeed play a constructive role in diplomacy by introducing concepts inherent to the spiritual and ethical sphere, such as mercy, love, generosity, comprehension, hospitality, and forgiveness. These are all values that are common to many different religions and introduce behavior consistent with such values. But it's not enough. There are, in fact, many other values that faith-based institutions bring to conflict resolution process. Firstly, the lack of a political or economic agenda that allow for a perception of neutrality on the part of the beneficiaries. Secondly, the sharing of many values with the secular world in the areas of human rights, social justice, and even the preservation and protection of the environment, the premise of our human survival. Third, religious actors have direct access to religious leaders around the world. These relations are indeed transactional and operate independently of states and have the potential to open new avenues of dialogue and conciliation. Last but not least, the stability of religious structure that in most cases remains in areas of conflicts and crisis even long after the moment of emergency to provide a continuous support. And it is no coincidence that, according to a study by Heston Knan, religious institutions provide on average 4.2 types of assistance compared to the 2.6 types covered by secular organizations. Religious actors are not only concerned with physical and material needs, but also with the spiritual and emotional sphere. Therefore, and especially in a globalized world where new actors are emerging all the time, the limits of the conventional diplomacy are becoming more and more evident, while a new form of diplomacy is emerging, what we call faith-based diplomacy, that emphasizes dialogue, mutual respect, and understanding. A new holistic approach has emerged that looks at society in all its components, replacing the traditional model of conflict resolutions. Of course, we realize that the faith-based diplomacy does not have at its disposal the weapons of persuasion inherent in traditional diplomacy. Faith-based diplomacy is based on the conviction that any kind of conflict always has an intangible side to it, which consists in the higher values that are inherent in every religion and which must therefore help to heal such conflicts, even if they go beyond one's own more concrete and immediate interest. And coming to Order of Malta, the above, I said, is an integral part of our charisma. In fact, the Order of Malta, a 900-year-old Catholic institution and subject of international law with a mission in 120 countries, has always moved on two different levels, although closely integrated. The two levels are cultural one and concrete action one. On the cultural level, in the awareness that faith-based diplomacy is fundamentally based on the rediscovery of certain shared values, the Order of Malta is strongly committed to promoting everything that serves to give a common basis of value to worlds that seem apparently different and distant. And so, in one of the Order of Malta extraterritorial headquarters in Rome, we facilitated a meeting between representatives of the Israel and Palestinian authorities, together with Jewish and Muslim scholars. We also support the delivery of a course of international humanitarian law for Liberian authorities, including key ministers and police and border officials. In addition, to raise awareness of the global meaning of religious and the role that religious leaders can play in conflicts, revolution, and peace building, we also place these values at the heart of the Compact Religious in Action, drafted by the Order of Malta with input from Christian and Muslim leaders. Indeed, the document contains principles and guidelines for the role that religious communities and institutions can play to help resolve crisis situations, mitigate their effect on the communities involved, and improve the joint provision and distribution of humanitarian aid. And just to give a few more examples in this regard, last June, the Order of Malta hosted in Rome the regular meeting of the Transatlantic Policy Network on Religion and Diplomacy, which is a forum of diplomats from Europe and North America and policymakers who support the geopolitics and of religions, religious literacy, and the promotion of inclusive societies. All this because it is clear that religion actors can and must be placed at the center of the cultural scene and further evaluated. There is an urgent need to provide diplomats and policymakers with knowledge of the role of religious actors. Therefore, religious literacy must be actively supported and promoted, especially in our Western environment, where it is unfortunately increasingly absent. But if the first plane on which the Order of Malta is moving is precisely that of trying to provide a common basis of value to the current protagonists of the world, there is a second plane on which, as we said, the Order of Malta has always been committed. It is our conviction, in fact, that diplomacy based on faith and interreligious dialogue first and foremost needs example given by concrete response. It is well known that our programs range from the management of hospitals, dispensaries, facilities for the elderly and disabled, to assistance projects for migrants and refugees, both in war-torn countries and in countries of arrival. And it is well known that our work to increase the protection of human rights and promote the dignity of human beings is intense. But what I like to emphasize here is that we carry out these activities with the spirit of neutrality and impartiality that is widely acknowledged, and that does not mean agnosticism. It means that our only agenda is to work to testify with facts that those values we have been talking about can really be practiced, and that it is in this way they can really help to resolve all kinds of conflicts. Wherever we operate, we do so in this spirit. In Lebanon, we have been running 11 social and medical services in cooperation with other religious communities for decades. And when I say in cooperation with, I mean Sunni Muslim, Shia Muslim, and Druze. In Bethlehem, we run since 1990 a maternity hospital, the Holy Family Hospital, with a state-of-the-art intensive care unit for premature babies and babies born with congenital disease. It is the only hospital in the whole region offering this kind of specialized care. Every year, over 4,600 babies are born. The hospital is a hope for families in the Bethlehem region, including refugees. In medical mobile clinics, pay regular weekly visits in the desert area of the West Bank, assisting the local women and providing essential medical care. At the Holy Family Hospital, Christians and Muslims work together daily, fostering peace. And again, when I allude to this cooperation, I mean that in Bethlehem Hospital, 97% of the mothers are Muslim, and that 97% of the staff are Muslim, and that the Shimon Peres Foundation has financed a scholarship to train young women gynecologists and obstetricians. And finally, in Bethlehem Hospital, on January 6 this year, the day of the Epiphany, the 100,000th child was born. In Iraq, in the plain of Nineveh, where several religions and ethnic minorities live, we help people displaced by Daesh persecution with the crucial support of religious leaders in charge of local reconstruction communities. And it should not be forgotten, again, to underline how it is possible to collaborate beyond diversity, that in Africa, and precisely in Togo, Cameroon, Benin, Ivory Coast, and Senegal, the Order of Malta manages as many hospitals with local staff and with the direction of new European General Manager, usually from France. On the other hand, and in conclusion, the Order of Malta also acts with the same criteria of neutrality in the Western world, in the many facilities for the elderly, and in the many hospitals we manage in this part of the world. We certainly pay no attention to the religion, ethnicity, or political belief of those in need. For us, service to man is preponderant. And coming today, the scenario in the war in Ukraine and the terrible earthquake in Turkey and Syria, we are doing precisely the same. The war in Ukraine has created the most rapid displacement crisis in Europe since the Second World War. Most of the displaced women are women and children, most at risk of exploitation and abuse. Moreover, the war also continues to have a major effect on global market, energy and food supplies, with catastrophic repercussions on countries already facing conflicts and crises, such as the East Africa region. This terrible scenario has caused governments and politics makers to reflect on the possibility of using and strengthening so-called track to diplomacy, unofficial behind-the-scene conflicts, mediation initiatives that are typically embodied by religious actors. In this area, the Order of Malta is channeling enormous effort that constantly aim to alleviate the tremendous pain suffered by that population and to protect and assist the civilian population with a view to reaching solution to the war. And in the catastrophic scenario of earthquake in Turkey and Syria, we equally act in the same spirit and in obedience to the same value. In conclusion, when the question arises as how religious institutions can act to heal the countless conflicts and to implement Pope Francis' appeal to stop the spiral of violence and death, the Order of Malta responds with the example of its action and with the conviction that only the sharing of certain higher values can really help. And to this end, the Order of Malta is always available to promote interreligious dialogue, to offer its seats for any meeting directed to this end, and to promote every effort to bring relief to anyone in need without distinction of religion, ethnicity, culture, or political belief. Therein lies the overlap of international diplomacy and religious diplomacy. I warmly thank all the outstanding members of this high-level panel and trust that today's discussion will lead to new ideas and proposals to overcome the current crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for the great insight and for showing how the hospitality of this panel is just one of many examples, how you use your relations and how you use your important network, faith-based network, to make this world hopefully a safer and more peaceful place. We have now an order of 6 statements from very different perspectives, and I've got the pleasure and privilege to first introduce the Archbishop Paul Richard Gallagher, who is the Secretary for Relations with States. And we are so excited that he is here, and he will introduce himself more clearly in his perspective, and after that we keep going as the panel continues. Your Excellency.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm most grateful to the Order of Malta for the invitation. The invitation was also to speak a little bit more briefly than was foreseen, so that means that what I am about to say is what I really want to say, what I really believe, and is rather than, shall I say, a statement of an institution as such. I think I'm going to approach it in a slightly more fundamentalist way, in that our theme is religion, diplomacy, and conflicts. Conflicts, we don't have any doubts about. Religion, perhaps. Diplomacy, many doubts at this time. So we've got a great subject. We are living in a moment of almost unprecedented pessimism about the state of the world. I think people say that there are something like 64, 65 overt conflicts in the world today, which merit the attention of the international community. And basically, people are anxious about the future of society, the future of the world, and then getting down to basics, to the future of themselves and their families. Their expectations are not great. In this, we then have the question of the role of religion. And as we've just heard from the Grand Chancellor, one of the things that we, particularly in the West, and most particularly in Europe, that we have to come to terms with is that religion counts and is important to the vast majority of people who walk on this planet. It is not the marginal activity of groups of, shall I say, either fanatics or dilettantes on Sundays or Fridays or Saturdays, depending on your religion. That's not the case. Religion is very important, and in some parts of the world, it is determining. At the same time, religion is viewed by many of us, shall we say, of the international community, and many of us in the part of the world which thinks that we make the decisions as part of the problem and not part of the solution. So it would be much better if religion went away. And that has been a covert policy of much of the international community for many, many decades. And we somewhat live with the consequences today. At the same time, we have diplomacy. Diplomacy is not a dark art, as some would make it out to be. I represent an institution which is attributed, or accused perhaps, of being one of the institutions which has practiced and maybe even created a modern diplomacy over the centuries. Well, diplomacy is something that has been somewhat lacking in recent years. And we see the situation in which we find ourselves today, not because of an excess of diplomacy, but because of a lack of it. And this is also a critique of the institutions, particularly the institutions created in the wake of the Second World War, which in many ways have failed us in recent times. Now, you can throw your hands up in despair and say, well, this is a terrible situation, and surely humanity is sleepwalking together with that image which is often referred to about the First World War, in the run-up to the First World War, sleepwalking to disaster or more disasters. Well, I think that our subject today is actually a source of encouragement rather than of despair. Because in religion, people find a way of renewing their spirit. And what we need to combat the anxiety, the pessimism, we need hope, and we need people with faith. Faith in one sense, in a very general terms, not necessarily religious faith, but faith in themselves, faith in humanity, faith in the basic goodness of people. And religion can make a contribution in that sense. The Pope has, in recent years, during his pontificate, promoted very much the idea of this culture of encounter, of not being afraid to meet the other, to talk to the other, to contrast beliefs and things with the other. And certainly today we need a renewal of trust. One of the biggest problems in the international community is we don't believe a word which the other one says. And maybe that's somewhat justified, because it's not just us who have to renew our trust, it's others have to be renewed to be able to enjoy our trust, and so that we can then establish a mutual trust. And if we don't establish those things, then really that we are in a difficult situation. And in renewing those institutions that I talked about before. But diplomacy in itself is always going to be something that obliges those involved in it, in any way and at any level, to reach out. You can't be a diplomat without talking to the other. You can't be a diplomat without exchanging with the other. You have to be, in some ways, convinced, and we all know, those of us who practice this dark art, is that the personal dimension is extremely, extremely important. If you are a friend with somebody who the rest of the world considers to be your enemy, the chances that you will actually be able to put something together and make some progress. And that's what we need. We also need ethical renewal. We need to appreciate peace. We need a culture of peace, which sadly is lacking today. We have to convince ourselves, as we have sadly betrayed ourselves perhaps in recent years, that we can resolve problems through a culture of peace rather than making the military option, rather than making the option of confrontation and conflict. And we have to realize, above all, that in these conflicts, there are people just like you and me. And that's the first big temptation, is to think that the opposition, the enemy, is different from you and me. And that's something that religion can help us with, because religion says that God is actually treating us all as equals. Why should we do anything different? So these I think, are the things that are really important, and something which religion can make a contribution. Above all, I think one of the things that has failed us in diplomacy in recent years is the sort of discourse that we have, the sort of narrative that we have, and the narrative that goes on between us as diplomats. One of the things that religion can do, because religion has its own narrative, each religion has its own narrative, its own sacred scriptures, its own tradition of passing on the faith from one generation to another. That discourse can be renewing. It can help us to revitalize our diplomatic vocabulary, our diplomatic way of approaching things, rather than constantly hammering on. I think I'm going to stop there, because I think first of all, I've said enough. Secondly, I think that just to conclude, I think that in religion, there is the sort of virtuous side of religion. And in the virtuous side of religion, there are skills, there are techniques, there are things that we desperately need in conflict resolution and in the exercise of diplomacy. As I say, we have to value each other more. We have to value people. We have to see people as a resource. We have to learn courtesy, discretion, and loyalty. And above all, we have to learn trust. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Your Excellency, Archbishop Gallagher, for these insights from both a person of faith and a diplomat. And I like the idea of diplomacy being the dark arts, and at the same time, the dark arts have a very light side to them. And so thank you for what you just said. We now hear a totally different voice. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Professor Azza Karam. She is the Secretary General of Religions for Peace, with many international and interrelational experiences from the universal side of things, in a way. And so please, Professor Karam, give us your perspective.
Thank you very much. Eminences, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, sincere thanks to the Order of Malta, not only for this gracious hosting of us, but actually for making this particular panel in this incredibly important space a reality and a possibility. So it's not easy to be able to secure the space for religions to come together, and therefore it is a big achievement, and we give you thanks for it. I also wish to just ask you, if you'll please allow me, Madam Moderator, to ask everybody to take a moment of silence together and think about the victims of the Turkey and Syria earthquake. Let us just take a moment to reflect together. Thank you very much. We speak about the culture of peace, and it is indeed absolutely necessary and seriously lacking. We also understand that, as the Grand Chancellor made very clear, a significant number of basic social services provided around the world actually are provided through and by religious institutions. In the United States of America, 70% of hospitals are run by and through the Catholic Church and Catholic Church-related institutions. If this is the case in the United States of America, we know that across the continent of sub-Saharan Africa, over 40% of basic health care is being provided through religious institutions, and that figure is only relevant to the Christian context. We do not know, when we add the Muslim, the Hindu, the Buddhist, various establishments and institutions, I will wager you that a great deal more of basic social infrastructure, basic needs of people are actually being provided by and through religious institutions. But we're also here in this context with a backdrop that is absolutely critical, which is the Russian war in the Ukraine. Now, we would be remiss if we don't pause for a second to reflect on the fact that this war has been declared holy by a senior, most very critical leader of a very large church in this world and in our constitutional infrastructure of religion. So yes, indeed, religions are, in many cases, actually lifesavers, first responders in humanitarian disasters. We know for a fact that a good number of from the top 10 humanitarian organizations in the world, at least 4 of the top 10 are religious. So we know that religions are there as lifesavers in many cases. We know that religions are there, institutions are there to protect dignity by providing basic needs. But we also must be able to understand and appreciate that religious fervor and passion can often be used to create the exact opposite of a culture of peace, indeed to justify war. For those who may have forgotten, before the US engagement in Afghanistan and Iraq, there were senior-most religious leaders speaking to the righteousness of a just war in these contexts. Let us not forget that that aspect exists. And indeed, nevertheless, let us not dwell only on that aspect, which is what traditional diplomacy tends to do. Thanks to the German Federal Foreign Office, we were able, my organization, Religions for Peace, together with a foundation, a German foundation, to actually host a meeting on faith and diplomacy. It was the first international meeting, conference on faith and diplomacy, in which religious leaders and traditional diplomats were convened with academics. One of the moments of humor, but also of tremendous wisdom, came when a Palestinian Lutheran bishop looked very graciously and kindly at the gathered diplomats in the room and said, "Do you really think you're the only diplomats around? We created diplomacy as religious leaders. We're the original diplomats." And he reminded of the Austro-Hungarian, the Habsburg, the Ottoman empires, which were very much influenced by, and indeed directed to a large extent, by the relationship between the political and the religious establishments. And therefore, we speak and we know that there is a legacy over centuries of religious leaders being the original diplomats that shuttled back and forth and tried to secure specific gains, whether territorial or intellectual. Important to keep that history and legacy in mind, because as we are reminded by His Eminence, there is a tremendous wealth of wisdom in the discourse of religious actors that the secular diplomats may well stand to gain from. And that point cannot be emphasized enough. However, there is a fallacy and a myth that needs to be perhaps questioned, if not downright broken, which is that religion is all good, and when you bring religion into the equation, peace prevails. Frankly, there is no such thing as religion. There are multiple religions and faiths, and quite frankly, the legacy of religions or religious institutions and faith traditions working together isn't exactly stellar. In the organization that I serve, which is like the United Nations, instead of having governments, it has religious institutions and faith communities around the world represented as peers, from the indigenous peoples to the Holy See. They sit together as peers when they show up. They work together through 90+ inter-religious councils in 90 countries. The multi-religious is the hidden tipping point of diplomacy. When multi-religious happens, it is the #1 antidote to any form of fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism, let alone extremism. We are distinguishing because not all religious fundamentalisms are per definition bad, but the antidote to religious fundamentalism is multi-religious collaboration. And it is darn difficult. I believe God Himself has been trying to get it to be done for quite some time. We're not exactly doing a stellar job of religious institutions actually coming together as equals to collaborate and to speak as one. Usually one religious leader speaks, some parts of the world listen, and it is as if that is the voice of religion. It is the voice of wisdom, for sure. It is not the voice of all religions and faiths. It is important for us to distance ourselves from that particular colonial mindset that one religious leader speaks for all. Secondly, the multi-religious is not a skill that every single religious leader and every single religious institution actually has and is born with. Quite to the contrary. The multi-religious collaboration is actually something that is hard to achieve, and it comes through practice, and it involves learning from failures. There are plenty religious institutions, plenty religious leaders, in fact they're the majority, but in fact very few who are skilled and competent at working multi-religiously. Usually that entails working across not only religious convictions and theologies and dogma, but it entails very critically working across regions, working across cultural understandings. They are incredibly competent diplomats when they can be and are skilled at multi-religious collaboration. So when we say we've invited religious leaders here, there, and everywhere, and we tick the box, you see, we're working with religion now, which increasingly many governments are doing, that's not good enough. In fact, it's actually perhaps quite problematic, because not every religious leader is committed and savvy and competent in working multi-religiously, multinationally. And when they do that, not only is it an antidote to fundamentalism, but it actually is the securest way of upholding human dignity and human rights. Usually when you come together across your differences and are willing and serve together, you are also able to overcome those little things that say, this human right is not a good idea. This human right shouldn't really be a right. This human right isn't a priority. When you work together as religious institutions and people of faith, you realize that the common element is human dignity, which is human rights, and that securing them all for everybody at all times is the tipping point to the creation of a culture of peace. The third and last point, important to work multi-religiously, because that is diplomatic skill, important to collaborate, but even more important, multi-religious collaboration is not about hosting great meetings with religious leaders, each of them remarkably significant and wondrous. It's great, but it is by no means enough. It is actually when they come together in service to their communities. That is the litmus test for the extent to which these religious orders, organizations, institutions, and leaders are actually committed to transforming that world we live in towards the realization of a culture of peace, when they serve together. And this is why my organization has been very humbled to observe and to support the work of the Order of Malta in many cases, but also to observe and support the work of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. The understanding is that when religions pool their most precious resources together, people and money, towards the service of common needs, that is the diplomacy that we're missing today. We can most certainly point our fingers towards the secular establishments, diplomatic, foreign affairs, defense. We can point multiple fingers to them. But it behooves us, those of us who work in the religious spaces, to realize that the rest of the fingers are pointing towards ourselves and our own leadership and our own institutions, and to question systematically and be held accountable to whether the religious institutions are not only hosting everybody else, but actually ready, willing, and able to pool their resources to serve together. Religions for Peace created a multi-religious humanitarian fund from which we were able to take, together with UNHCR, to support the work of UNHCR in Moldova as well as elsewhere, where the Ukrainian refugees are being warmly welcomed in a poor country, one of the poorest countries in Europe, warmly welcomed by their Moldovan counterparts. Religious leaders have come together to serve this space together. It's interesting to note, however, that whereas the multi-religious fund has supported and enabled, very few religious institutions are contributing to this fund. Thank you.
So much. The microphone works by itself, Rabbi. He's going to do it. Thank you so much, Professor Azza Karam. We can see how important it is to be multilateral, to be unified, and to work together, and to see that this is also work that needs to be done. It doesn't come for free. It doesn't come naturally. Thanks for reminding us, and thank you for making this valuable point as a pre-point to this conference. And as we are being multilateral and multi-faith based on this panel as well, I'm very pleased now to present Rabbi Goldschmidt, who is the head of the European Conference of Rabbis, and to share his insight and his perspective. A very warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Before I start my remarks, I just would like to mention that we have sitting here with us in the auditorium the president of the Jewish community of Bavaria, Munich, who just not a long time ago celebrated her 90th birthday, a Holocaust survivor, Dr. Charlotte Knobloch, who is really symbolizing the role of religion in building and rebuilding. Thank you. I would like to thank for being invited to this very prestigious gathering and panel by the Order of Malta, and also by Benedict Franke. Just remembered a few years ago, I met with Benedict Franke, and we spoke about the conference, and I said I'm going to meet soon the Pope Francis, and so Benedict Franke told me, invite him as the guest of honor to the Munich Security Conference. So when I met with His Holiness the Pope and I told him, you're invited as the guest of honor, so he told me, it's dangerous. So what is dangerous? There's too much beer in Munich. putting jokes aside, last time I met with Pope Francis, we spoke about the Russian-Ukrainian war. And Pope Francis said something I fully agree with. We are in the middle of World War III. Maybe this war is not a hot war, it's a cold war, a war, an economic war, but we still are in a world conflict right now. And this shows us to what extent religion can play, and it was very well said by His Eminence as well as by your professor, religion is a double-edged sword. It can play a great role for peace, and it can also create a great role for war. Unfortunately, the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church chose to call this war a jihad, a holy war, mobilizing his church for this terrible war which killed over 200,000 people up until now. I took a different position. It was very difficult. We were put under pressure by our government in Russia to support the war, and I decided not to do it because morally you cannot support this war. Many people chose silence, and I said that silence was not enough. We have to speak out. And I left my post after 33 years. I resigned, and I said that this war is a catastrophe, not only for Ukraine, it is a catastrophe for Russia as well, as we see it. And it is a catastrophe for the world. But if you want to see where religion can play a great role for peace, just yesterday, in Abu Dhabi, the house of the Abrahamic family, the houses of the Abrahamic family were inaugurated by the Crown Prince with a church, a Catholic church, a mosque, and a synagogue. And these Abrahamic Accords, what we're talking about, we are in the year 2023. We have had conflicts in the Middle East between states, between religions, between faiths, years of bloody conflicts, of wars. And when the time came for peace, those people who chose peace, what did they say? We're going to take the figure of a person who was not a king, who was not a general, but was a religious leader, Abraham, the father of the Abrahamic faiths. And he's going to be the model for a new peace in the Middle East. That's the model where religion, we're talking about conflict, diplomacy, and religion. Here, this is diplomacy, religion, and conflict resolution. Abraham lived 4,000 years ago. He was not a king, and he was not a general. He created a family which today billions of people all over the world, Christians, Muslims, and Jews, sees as their role model and father. And that's the message we can come and give to the whole world. What do I see? How can religion have a positive impact on what is happening today? My neighbor, Professor Azza Karam, the Secretary General for Religion for Peace, I approached her a few months ago to speak out, that religious leaders should speak out about the thousands and thousands of political prisoners who are in Belarus and Russia today, in prisons, partially tortured and killed by regimes which have a total disregard of human rights. And I think, and I thank your organization, Religion for Peace, for speaking out, but much more should be done in that respect. We religious leaders should speak out and say that it is incomprehensible that in Europe, 80 years after the Holocaust, people are being tortured in prisons, and thousands of people are in prison just for one sin, for speaking out against the war. We have to speak out all together. And my last remark is the following. The last century, the 20th century, was a century of secularism. The secular institutions and secular movements had much influence. It was basically communism and Nazism. This century started with 9/11, a religious war. And religions play a much greater role in questions and war and peace. And therefore, the Order of Malta, which is one of the oldest religious organizations in the world, having survived so many upheavals, changes, political changes, moving from one country to another, but dealing with helping humanity, for providing help for those, for the poor and for the sick and for the naked. This organization survived and continues to thrive, and is an example for all other organizations of other faiths. And here on the Conference of European Rabbis, we're very happy to be here with you today, and would like to amplify this voice for freedom, for peace, and for humanity, for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rabbi Goldschmidt. We are so impressed by what you actually, where you are coming from and what you've been given up, and that you come from the heart of the conflict in Moscow, in Russia. And I'm very, very grateful that you came here and that you are sharing your insights with us. We're now moving on. Time is moving equally fast. We're moving on now to another voice on the panel. We're moving on to Mrs. Nazila Ghanea. She is the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief, and we're very excited to hear what she has to contribute.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and I'll just be brief in thanking you for making this happen. I'm very excited that we're having this theme addressed at this important conference. I'm looking at it from, let's bring the voice or bring a perspective from the UN human rights mechanisms. So what does peace look like in terms of the objective or the landscape of the UN human rights mechanisms? It is to see that access to human rights, enjoyment of human rights, itself be a contributor to security and to the prevention of conflicts. And what is the diplomacy there? Well, the diplomacy takes a particular form. It is guided by interstate fora, for example, the Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly, and its diplomacy, its channels, okay, which I know many of you are active in those channels. But you know, the peace and diplomacy is coming from a particular perspective. So what can human rights do? And within that, where does freedom of religion or belief find itself in its hope to contribute to the prevention of conflict, the prevention of violence, and greater understanding and peace? Freedom of religion or belief is not new to these international fora. It was one of the 4 freedoms even before the United Nations. It was at the center and part and parcel of the protections of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all the subsequent treaties and mechanisms. One of the mechanisms that the UN gradually built up from the 60s onwards were the special rapporteurs. What was realized is that these intergovernmental bodies are only meeting occasionally at the international level. Who is going to be reporting on countries and on particular themes between sessions? Do we make a particular diplomat responsible? Well, they have a particular role and they have a particular perspective. So gradually what has evolved is that we have some 55 special rapporteurs on different themes and countries, and one of them addresses, this mandate addresses freedom of religion or belief. So it's unpaid, it's impartial, it's an independent role, and it keeps freedom of religion or belief on the agenda and reports to the United Nations twice a year with particular thematic reports. It carries out country visits. Funds are severely limited, so it's 2 country visits per year and reporting more in depth on the situation of freedom of religion or belief in those countries. But you know, over the years, and it's 37 years that we've had a special rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, 45 countries have been visited. There's detailed reports. There are thematic reports over those 37 years. And also there are communications. The communications are very interesting. If, you know, so if there are violations that are happening regarding freedom of religion or belief, often it's in addition to other human rights violations. There can be an intervention on behalf of that individual or individuals from the special rapporteur. So, you know, we hear about a particular situation, we make sure there is the consent of the victims, then we detail the rights that are being violated or appear to be violated in relation to that case. So, you know, it can be the Rohingya, it can be in relation to the Yazidis, it can indeed be in relation to atheists, it can be in relation to Christians, or it could be that it's got a range of victims. So those victims will have an intervention on their behalf to the government saying, we have heard of this situation, please can you tell us what your government is doing in relation to responding to it and remedying it. And after 60 days, that is made public. So again, those whose rights are being violated now have UN-headed paper, a URL, in which they can refer to in their advocacy to try and address the violation that is occurring, and press releases. So these are the tools, the diplomatic tools, if you like, in the hand of the special rapporteur to try and advance freedom of religion or belief. Freedom of religion or belief is understood as broader than religion in the sense that we're talking about it today. So freedom of thought, conscience, religion or belief. The realm of conscience is being protected so that people and peoples can freely maneuver in that and follow their conscience and find their conscience and change their religion or belief if they so choose. So it's a protection for this sphere. What do I find in this sphere in relation to religion and the reduction of conflict and peace? First, I find a strong, as the Archbishop was saying earlier, a strong atmosphere of the sense that religion is a challenge to human rights and not a contributor to advancing human rights. I have to be honest that that seems to be quite a dominant sense in the human rights, these human rights fora. Of course, we challenge it and we give evidence to the contrary or put it in a broader perspective. A second is an assumption that perhaps religion is incapable of being inclusive. And I think examples like the ones Professor Karam shared, and also all of us know, are worthy of putting forward very strongly to show, to illustrate that that is not the case. Yes, it's also a prejudice, right? Or it's also blinkered. It has some evidence, of course, but it is blinkered and not a complete picture. There's an assumption that religion is an obstacle, especially to freedom of expression. And when we think of incidents around the world and how emotive the responses to it might be in the public or in protests, etc., then one can understand where that is coming from, but also one absolutely has to challenge that. And there's a lot of guidance, there's a lot of soft law tools, even within the United Nations, that challenge that. But let's make sure, you know, the question or the viewpoints of religion are often being cancelled in many discussions. People speak about a hostile environment to the sharing of religious positions on some matters. Let's make sure that we are not doing the same or also cancelling out. We have to live in this world in all our diversities. We have to coexist and we have to speak to one another. One of the things that we should be calling for is open and vigorous debate. Let's not use human rights law or other trump cards as a means of silencing or reducing the voice of the others. Let's hear them and let's seek to respectfully engage them rather than pretending it doesn't exist. You know, those who aren't religious say that all religions are fundamentalist or extremist, or they are not progressive, and those who aren't religious saying that all religions are fundamentalist. You know, let's not accept the polarization. I want to refer to two of the points that predecessors, previous mandate holders have proposed for us. One is that let's not use religion as the lens to understand every situation. It offers a very valuable, precious lens, but it is not the only way of seeing things. And I want to give the example of religious persecution. If we call everything religious persecution, let's assess in a sober way afterwards. For example, we called South Sudan religious persecution. I'm not saying, I have no expertise on South Sudan, but if we just assess it subsequently some years on, was it helpful or was it neutral or was it unhelpful in addressing the situation? Let's be mindful of the language we use, because even if it has a religious dimension or even a religious persecution dimension, diplomatically, in terms of resolving the situation, is our advocacy and that language helpful, neutral, or detrimental to the situation? Another Professor Shahid also referred to this as right-sizing religion. Religion is important. Often it is excluded from the debate, but when we bring it into the debate, let's give it the right profile publicly or even in our assessments, that it is one of many ways of understanding complex situations that are multidimensional. In human rights advocacy, sometimes I find that freedom of religion or belief is given as the only rationale for what is happening in different parts of the world. Yet it is often in addition to poverty, in addition to entrenched ethnic differences, in addition to prejudices, in addition to caste discrimination and other discrimination. So let's be mindful of the different ways of understanding it in order to be able to actually contribute in a more helpful way to the resolving of the situations. Religion as a security issue, we are here. Certainly religion or belief is a security issue. But when I look at country situations, normalizing the fact that religious communities will be controlled and managed, and there will be surveillance, and there will be control about who is recognized, who is not recognized, who is registered, who is in the Constitution, who isn't. I find that hugely unhelpful. If we are truly contributing or believing in religion or belief as a contributor to peace, we will give a free rein and an open space to religion or belief, except in the really exceptional circumstances that it is really being used really as a camouflage for calling for violence and terrorism, okay? But that is really exceptional. We don't solve terrorism by controlling everything to do with religion and keeping the debate only open to certain characters that are controlled and dictated by a particular governmental authority. So let's make sure that securitizing the question of religion is truly exceptional rather than normalized. And finally, so in my work, I recognize that we have freedom of religion or belief, the right of everybody to have, to adopt, to change religion or belief, and to be able to manifest it, including with others and in public. That is kind of at the heart of what is freedom of religion or belief, that I'm sure we all care about. But there is also discrimination on grounds of religion or belief, that somebody is being targeted for violations or restrictions because they belong to this religion or this belief. More broadly, in human rights terms, we should also be aware of human rights violations that are being perpetuated in the name of religion. I am not a theologian of all religions and beliefs, so it's not for me to say whether this is really religious or it isn't. We can just observe that those violations are being called for or perpetuated in the name of religion or belief. What I've brought to the table is to say that, yes, it is sometimes possible that religion or belief is used as a grounds for restriction, but we have also seen examples, including in the UN human rights mechanisms, that religion or belief can be part of the solution, can be part of the most powerful responses to overcoming that, and to actually questioning those violations in the name of religion or belief. Faith for Rights, that Michael is going to talk about, is one such example of bringing religions and beliefs together to say that see how religions or beliefs can play a positive role in relation to the advancement and the securing of all human rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Nazila Ghanea, for your insight from the UN side of things. And this is building a great ramp to our next panelist, who is also speaking from the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights perspective, from the UN perspective, Michael Wiener, originally German, and he is, has contributed to many conferences and papers, and he, in a way, is in the diplomatic fieldwork. And so give us your insight. Thank you.
Many thanks indeed, and I would really like to pick up several of the points that the previous speakers have already mentioned, and really bringing them together, as Nazila was just mentioning, about how to really support and facilitate the positive contributions of the various religious or belief actors. And there, I think really, I very much like the title of this panel, Piecing It Together, which, I mean, not only plays with the words, but with the concepts. And I would argue that piecing it together with a faith for rights approach would be really giving the direction to it. And I'm saying it because we have so many concrete examples, some of which were already mentioned, of either very positive or less positive influences by faith-based actors. And I would like to focus on three very concrete examples. The first one is on Cyprus. There we have an example of a track 2 diplomacy, where you had really decades of protracted conflict and discussions in the first diplomatic track, which didn't really succeed, as we all know. And for a decade now, the religious track of the Cyprus peace process is bringing together the various religious leaders. And even though the Cyprus conflict is not a religious conflict as such, but the religious leaders have also suffered, and for decades they haven't even talked with each other. And that's part of the problem. And I'm saying it because for a decade now, there have been these discussions, first behind the scenes, and then very concretely together, also publicly, bringing together the divided islands, religious leaders from the various confessions and religions. And there are very concrete examples and really positive impact of having access to places of worship, to, for example, the biggest mosque in the south, or to several Christian places of worship, churches, cemeteries in the north, which wasn't possible in the past. And I think here what we need, and that's precisely what Nazila and also Azza have been personally involved, is the formulation of a conceptual framework, so 18 commitments on faith for rights, and a methodology. And here again, to give a concrete shout out to Azza's also previous role in the United Nations in bringing in peer-to-peer learning. This is, to me, the most efficient way of bringing people together. Everyone has something to contribute, something to learn, really listening to each other, sharing experiences, what works and what doesn't work. And very concretely, the 18 commitments on faith for rights were translated by the religious track into Greek and Turkish, precisely to be able to talk about these concepts, about these ideas, about looking into how you can actually implement these in practical terms with places of worship, with joint activities, with youth and social media campaigns on human trafficking, on violence against women. So very concrete grassroots activities. And just to give you one more concrete example how things can trickle up very concretely from the local levels to the United Nations. The Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues has every year a forum on minority issues in Geneva, but for the last 5 years he also instituted regional forums, which I think is really important because there you can also get into the granularity and understand what is happening there. And in the Europe Regional Forum, the executive director of the religious track of the Cyprus Peace Process, she participated and explained her personal experiences, and also that it's important that the religious majorities understand the situation of the religious minorities, also knowing very well that most of the religions are somewhere a minority and somewhere a majority. Some are also always a minority. But I think it's really important to understand and to have this minority perspective and minority lens ingrained. So what she was really bringing into that discussion was a concrete plea to not securitize, as the Special Rapporteur was saying, to really engage with the various religious or belief communities from a grassroots perspective with the Faith for Rights approach. This trickled up to the Forum on Minority Issues in Geneva. There was a concrete recommendation by the forum that the states, the United Nations, the regional and international organizations and civil society should engage with the various faith-based actors, including using the Faith for Rights approach and methodology and toolkit. And this was picked up by the Human Rights Council in a resolution. So just to give you a concrete example how things can not only trickle down, but trickle up. The second country example I wanted to give, albeit less positive, is Afghanistan. There, as we all know, already 20 years ago, actually, when the Taliban were already running the country for 5 years, there were huge problems in terms of, for example, the destruction of the Bamyan statues, where the predecessor of the Special Rapporteur sent 2 urgent appeals to the leader of the Taliban directly, which was first in 2001 to address not a state but a de facto authority. It didn't prevent the destruction of the Bamyan structures, but I think the engagement with these also de facto authorities has evolved. And to give a concrete example, there was a joint urgent appeal again a bit more than a year ago, directly addressed to the Taliban leadership, and also using international human rights law standards, but also Sharia provisions in the sense of you need to abide by these international standards. And by the way, also your own religious texts are supporting this in itself. My third example, very briefly in view of the time, the Democratic Republic of Congo, where again we have huge problems in terms of hate speech, about incitement to hatred and violence, and also the way that religious leaders can and should be brought into the discussion and equation. And here again, I think the recommendations were very concrete and using these soft law standards, Faith for Rights framework, in order to really go to the matter and to the heart of how to solve the problems. And just in conclusion, just going back again, how can these various actors be brought together? And I think here we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Religions for Peace, the various religious communities, the mandate holders, the United Nations entities, they are already working together. That can be enlarged, and that's what we are actively supporting and working for. But I think we have also the conceptual framework, we have the methodology with peer-to-peer learning, and so, in conclusion, piecing it together with a Faith for Rights approach.
Thank you so much. Dr. Michael Wiener, I greatly admire your all panelists' expertise that you're also already reacting to each other because time is running, and you already integrate what you're saying into what the other said, which is a very good of peer talk, I think. Now, last but definitely not least, Dr. Johannes Oerdemann from the Ecumenical Institute in Paderborn, the Adam Möhler Institute. He's a specialist on Orthodox. As a Catholic, he's a specialist on ecumenism from the Orthodox perspective. And I'm really interested what you were going to say on this specific situation, which is in the Ukrainian conflict. Which role does the Orthodox Church play, and what you have to say from this perspective? Thank you.
Thank you for introducing me, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. Well, I have the difficult task to talk about the position of the Orthodox Church, especially in view to the war in Ukraine, and I will neither defend the position of the Moscow Patriarchate nor criticize in depth because I have no time. But I would like to give some examples how also religion in this conflict could be a matter of peace building. When Russian troops invaded large parts of Ukrainian territory in February 2022, one of the reasons given by the Russian side was the protection of Russian Orthodox believers in Ukraine, who were allegedly being persecuted by the regime in Kiev. So does this mean that the war in Ukraine is ultimately a religious war? My answer is no, it is not. It is the war of an imperial power against an independent state which freed itself from the shackles of that same empire in a gradual and highly controversial process during the last 30 years. Religion is not the cause of this conflict, but is being misused by the Russian side to legitimize their invasion. In this war, however, not only religion, but also history is being instrumentalized. For centuries, the Christians in what is now Ukraine lived in an area of tension between Constantinople, Moscow, and Rome. While Constantinople dominated the ecclesiastical scene in the beginning, the Christian population turned towards Rome during the time when large parts of today's Ukraine belonged to the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, while Moscow determined ecclesial matters from the end of the 17th century onwards. The country's location on the border between empires, reflected in the Slavic term Ukraine, has meant that there is a religiously plural landscape in Ukraine. Ukraine is not an Orthodox country in the sense that could be said of Greece or Serbia, but a country of religious diversity, where the Orthodox are in the majority, about 60%, but there is also a large Catholic minority as well as significant minorities of Protestants, Jews, and Muslims. It is remarkable what role the All-Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organization has played since the beginning of the Russian invasion. It has spoken out from the beginning with clear statements and has as early as March 2022 called for the establishment of humanitarian corridors and an exchange of prisoners. The All-Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations thus became a clearly perceptible voice of Ukrainian civil society. That it is also perceived as such at the international level was recently demonstrated when Pope Francis received an official delegation of the Council in the Vatican on 25th of January 2023. In my view, the All-Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations is an example of the role that faith-based diplomacy can play in conflicts. But what about the role of the Orthodox Church in this war? Can it contribute to conflict resolution? I see little potential on the part of the Russian Church leadership, where Patriarch Kirill clearly backs Putin's policies and his justification for the war. Conversely, the leaders of the two Orthodox churches in Ukraine, Metropolitan Onufry of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and Metropolitan Epiphany of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, have embraced the Ukrainian view from the beginning. Unfortunately, the tensions between the two Orthodox churches in Ukraine, which have been building up for almost 30 years, make a reconciliation at the level of the hierarchy rather unlikely at the present. In my view, however, it's important to look not only at what the bishops say, but also what is happening at the grassroots levels of the church. In Russia, there were open letters in which Orthodox priests condemned the war unequivocally, initially signed by name and most recently anonymously in the form of a Christmas declaration by Russian peace activists. In Ukraine, priests of both Orthodox churches have already met twice to discuss forums of cooperation, which indicates that there is a greater sympathy among them than official declarations show. In view of the war propaganda in the media, in which official church representatives unfortunately allow themselves to be drawn in, it is difficult to identify starting points for a peace-building role of the churches. Nevertheless, I will try. First, with a view to the Russian side. A point of reference here might be the fact that the Moscow Patriarchate explicitly defines itself as a multi-ethnic church in its statute. This can be seen critically as an expression of an imperial self-image, but it can also be seen positively as a critical corrective to the Russian world narrative that Putin likes to use. Let us look at the Ukrainian side. In my view, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under Metropolitan Onufry could play a key role here. This church was traditionally linked to Moscow, but broke away from the Moscow Patriarchate due to the Russian invasion by a decision of its church council at the end of May 2022. Its canonical status is currently unclear. It sits between the two chairs, so to say. The Ukrainian state accuses some of its bishops and priests of being collaborators with Moscow and is trying to have the church banned. This is a hazardous approach because it indirectly confirms the Russian narrative that the faithful of the Moscow Patriarchate are being persecuted in Ukraine. Moreover, it's questionable whether such efforts are compatible with the right to religious freedom that the Ukrainian state officially recognizes. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church is still structurally the largest church in Ukraine, with more than 10,000 parishes and thousands of priests. It combines the different trends that exists in Ukrainian society. Even though this church has broken away from Moscow, its traditional ties with Russia may offer a chance to mediate between the two sides in this conflict. I would like to conclude my intervention with a quote from the Christmas declaration mentioned above. In this remarkable document, Christians from Russia declare, I quote, "We believe that the military aggression of Russia against Ukraine is a violation of God's holy commandments, and its moral justification contradicts Christian teaching. We believe that imagined or real crimes of other states cannot justify the crimes of our own state. We disagree with the notion that patriotism means blind loyalty and love to the state and its ruler. We are horrified by the fact that many church officials and theologians, in an attempt to justify this invasion, are distorting the truth of the Holy Scriptures and rejecting the commandments from the Sermon on the Mount as something superfluous and irrelevant. We know that God urges us to love our neighbor, and we are certain that the neighbor, for us, Russian Christians, is the suffering people of Ukraine, whom God calls us to serve in word and in deed, by our prayers, by our solidarity, and by our intervention." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alderman. I think the words of the Christmas declaration moved our hearts once again, and I think it is not as well known as it should be, because, of course, media partly are not as interested in contributing it as they should be, and I think it's very important that you actually gave this to us. We've only got very few minutes left, which is always the way when a panel is loaded with impact and important people. So in the remaining 3 minutes, I asked each of you to formulate one wish only, to the Peace Conference. One wish saying, what do we want this conference in this very year to learn or to listen to from the voice of religion? One sentence each. And now it's your time first. Just pick one of your quotes.
Well, my plea would be to the organizers of this conference, please ensure that religion receives greater attention in foreign policy. In the Foreign Office in Berlin, shortly, the position of an advisor on religious affairs was eliminated. And I think that's the wrong signal at the wrong time. You need to strengthen the department on these affairs, and not it should be increased and not reduced.
Don't get me started on this. Yes, that's my daily life. Okay, one more.
I have one very concrete wish that what we learned from the grassroots in Cyprus trickles up not only to the United Nations but also to this conference. So there would be a very concrete recommendation or formulation, again inspired from this grassroots experience, which is that states, the United Nations, regional organizations, and civil society should support together the positive contributions of faith-based actors using the Faith for Rights approach and toolkit.
Thank you. Ms. Gania.
Thank you. My request is that religion and diplomacy always continue to widen its horizon and its scope to become more inclusive and to not control, to inadvertently, I'm not saying it's conscious, but to facilitate civil society in all its diversity, rather than to replace those voices.
Thank you so much. Rabbi Goldschmidt.
I disagree with you that I think there's a big religious element to this conflict, and the fact that Ukraine got the autocephaly in 2018 added to the reason the patriarch being so vocal on this. So there's a very, like the Irish conflict between Catholics and Protestants had a very big religious element, number one. And my wish is also that religious leaders will take the gamut and have the strength to express their voices and not being afraid, and that the world should listen to their voices.
Thank you so much. Professor Karam.
My one wish would be that religions in their plurality are never made conditional in any foreign policy or foreign affairs, but instead that I think this conference can be a space, a site to bring religious leaders and institutions together without giving priority to only one religion or only one institution, and to, by thus bringing them to continue to hold religious leaders accountable to peace and security through the human rights lens.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency.
My message to the conference and its leaders would be an invitation to think outside the box, to continue to dream for peace, and that faith challenges our preconceptions of the political world and invites renewal of our diplomacy.
A very warm applause to our 6 amazing and disciplined and fascinating perspective we had on this panel. I wish we could spend all day together. Maybe we just do. Anyway, I wish us all a great conference. I thank you all. Thanks to the Order of Malta for inviting this panel and for giving this valuable contribution to the subject we have at hand. Thank you so much.